did art first emerge? Certainly not in academies, museums, and galleries. The institutional structure of art is a product of the relatively recent past, developed over the last few centuries. But the desire to create is inherent, and not only in professional artists. Folk art is a significant component of the world's artistic heritage. Moreover, the very division of art into professional and folk, high art and applied art, insiders and outsiders, is artificial. Professional art represents just one of the stages in the history of art in a particular part of the globe. Ukrainian folk art is a mix of traditions, rooted both in antiquity and more modern developments. On the one hand, it seems to be frozen in time, following a set of codes and conventions from a bygone era. On the other, folk art is surprisingly adaptable, incorporating new technologies, materials, and even changing cultural values. Among the various forms of folk art, a special place is occupied by weaving, embroidery, and other methods of producing and embellishing fabric. Perhaps the most famous, a symbol of the country and its traditional culture, is the Ukrainian women's and men's embroidered shirt, the vyshivanka. Other interesting types of Ukrainian folk art are icons, folk paintings, murals painted on hut walls, embroidered towels called rushniki, and decorated Easter eggs called pisanki. One of the most common subjects of Ukrainian folk painting was the image of Kozak Mamai, a Ukrainian folk hero depicted sitting in the middle of the steppe holding a traditional Ukrainian musical instrument, a bandura. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, paintings of everyday subjects became quite common, mainly depicting idyllic landscapes and floral compositions. This art of the so-called silent majority is magnetic, not just due to its archetypal nature, but also because of the feeling of happiness that dominates most of the paintings. It may appear that the euphoric world captured in folk painting is representative of simple times, perpetuating a whimsical myth about the golden age of folk art existing in some sort of Ukrainian utopia. However, it should be remembered that the idealistic optimism of folk paintings acts as a kind of psychological protection strategy from the burdens of everyday life. The harder life is, the greater the desire for idyll. Ukrainian folk art is distinguished by its special attention to color. Preference is given to bright colors that have the strongest emotional impact. No less impressive are the pure geometric patterns. At the beginning of the 20th century, pioneer artists actively engaged with folk traditions. The aesthetics of Ukrainian folk art made a strong impression on avant-garde artists. Work cooperatives in the villages of Verbivka and Skopci were a fascinating phenomenon that arose from folk and avant-garde art crossover in the 1910s. The cooperatives were organized to help revive traditional embroidery and carpet weaving practices. One of the main figures of this collaboration between folk art and key figures of avant-garde was Yevgenia Pribilska, who curated these cooperatives. She invited avant-garde artist Alexandra Ekster to work there, as well as Kazimir Malevich, who would come later. These artists created sketches that were brought to life by master folk craftswomen. So primitive scarves, pillows, blankets, and bags were made at the workshops in Ukrainian villages and successfully sold in Poltava, Kyiv, Moscow, and Berlin. In Skopci, a new original artist emerged under the influence of Ekster and Pribilska. Her name was Hanna Sabachka Shostak, and she was a craftswoman of decorative and applied art who combined folk traditions and elements of the avant-garde in her work. Cosmic aspects of Ukrainian folk art had a strong impact on Ekster, Malevich, and other artists of this circle. Bright abstract fabrics, embroidery, and especially icons and pisanki or Easter eggs comprised intimate and priceless examples of an art that wasn't built on the principles of realism, but rather on rhythm and color, drawing on a wealth of archaic and magical imagination. These workshops became a unique space which produced some of the future luminaries of folk art in the Soviet period. One future star to emerge in Skopje alongside Sobachka Shostak was Paraska Vlasenko. Another one was the artist Yevmen Pshechenko, who came from the Verbivka workshop, which was headed by art patron Natalia Davidova and included Alexandra Ekster and Kazimir Malevich. Pshechenko's work was exhibited at the final exhibition of the Verbivka workshop at the Le Mercier Gallery in Moscow. That exhibition also featured works of Ekster, Malevich, Ivan Puni, Nina Genke-Meller, and Evgenia Pribilska. Verbivka produced another outstanding artist named Vasil Dovhoshiya. Sadly, there is little information preserved about this artist. In the 1920s, critics connected the originality of his work with his knowledge of Japanese art. Dovhoshiya apparently spent some time in Japan during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. Vibrant mixture of supremacist embroidery and old tradition of hut decoration, together with an archaic cosmic knowledge that was amplified under the influence of the avant-garde, gave life to one of the most interesting phenomena in the history of Ukrainian modernism, the so-called folk surrealism. The peak of the first wave of this movement came in the 1920s. At this time, no one was talking formally about surrealism. The art produced by some of the best artists associated with this movement, Pshechenko and Dovhoshiya in particular, was labeled as folk art. Artistic integrity, freedom of thought and originality of this artist was far ahead of other so-called professionals from this period. The art of Ukraine during Soviet times remains a blind spot in the history of world culture, especially during the tumultuous 1930s. This era of rapid industrialization coincided with Stalin's Great Terror, collectivization, and the Holodomor. In the arts, it was a time when the state forcibly imposed the dominant artistic method of socialist realism across the USSR. Theorists have long noted the lack of realism in socialist realism, famously described by Boris Groys as Stalin's avant-garde. In a way, totalitarian art of this era indeed grew from the utopian projects of the avant-garde. However, the 1930s were dominated by a rigid preference for the total cult of personality and hysterical pseudo-realistic optimism. Any form of experimentation could have ended in disaster. During the Great Terror, Ukraine suffered some of the most severe repressions among artists. An entire generation of bright cultural figures, physically annihilated during these years, received the poignant name executed Renaissance. A person could be executed or sent to labor camp for trivial reasons, a tractor not painted optimistically enough, or imaginary horns of Stalin seen by bureaucrats in a propaganda poster. Art became one of the most dangerous professions. The monotonous landscape of pompous Stalinist socialist realist art starts to come to life when one explores its margins. One striking area of artistic freedom was the domain of so-called folk art. Practiced by graduates of the people, artists who had not received a formal art education, this branch of art was nonetheless centrally supported and cultivated. Stalinist official art was created by men about men. Women, in the best-case scenario, took the role of supporting cast members. Folk art, conversely, became a niche in which an equal and sometimes dominating voice belonged to women. Traditionally, it was women who did embroidery and carpet weaving, as well as decorative drawings on the walls of their ovens and whitewashed homes in the villages. These decorative drawings are an ancient Ukrainian craft form which had a significant influence on the avant-garde as well as on the easel-based work of the Soviet period. It was from these decorative drawings that Petrikivka painting, a rich floral style of ornamentation, emerged later in the 20th century. In 1935, only 2 years after millions of Ukrainians died in a state-orchestrated famine, Holodomor, the preparations began for Ukraine's first Republic exhibition of folk art. According to the logic of Soviet power, artistic achievements of countryside villagers had to not only reflect the diversity of cultures within the USSR, but also serve as the visual embodiment of Stalinist slogan, "Life has become better, life has become happier." So happy, in fact, that even simple peasants would supposedly have enough free time to pick up a paintbrush. Experimental workshops were also organized at the Kyiv State Museum of Ukrainian Art with the aim of creating work for an exhibition at the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra. Talented masters of folk art came from all over Ukraine, developing their skills and artistic knowledge through creative collaboration. The best professional artists were invited, including a modernist and a long-time adherent of folk art, Vasyl Krychevsky, an avant-garde thespian Anatol Petritsky, graphic artist Vasyl Kasyan, and one of the most influential groups in the art of this era, the Boychukists. Hanna Sobotska-Shostak led composition workshops. Other participants of the workshops included sculptor Ivan Honchar, a member of the Honchar dynasty, Paraska Vlasenko, who took part in the Verbivka avant-garde cooperative, and Maria Primachenko. Professional artists created designs for the carpets that were weaved by the traditional craftswomen. This was the main ideological accent of the show. Most of the carpets had portraits of Lenin, Stalin, and other leaders of the Soviet Union. Ukraine's first Republic exhibition of folk art was shown in Kyiv in February 1936 and traveled to Moscow in July of the same year and then later to Leningrad. By a grim irony of life, while the exhibition was still on display, all the Boychukists among the professional artists who created these propagandistic designs were arrested, accused of treason, and executed. Repressions in Ukraine began long before 1937, but the Republic felt the horror of the Great Terror especially acutely. Futurist Mikhail Semenko, Boychuk's group, and hundreds of other cultural figures were shot. Ukrainian modernism at the beginning of the 20th century and the Soviet period seemed to be forever erased from the history of art. Nationally oriented Boychukism was especially hated by Soviet propaganda. Until the end of Stalin's reign, editorial articles of the main artistic printed organ of the USSR, the Искусство magazine, with enviable consistency presented a triumph over Boychukism as one of the main achievements on the path to the formation of a new canon. The state system executed Boychukists exactly for what it was praising the village artists who participated in Ukraine's First Republic exhibition of folk art, for using the elements of national style in their work. Paradoxically, these terrible events led to an emergence of a whole generation of female artists who managed not only to avoid repression, but to create completely non-Soviet art. Their works are rooted in the tradition of Ukrainian folk art, as well as international modernism. 4 figures, 4 generations, 4 destinies, and completely different artistic worlds: Hanna Sobotska, Maria Primachenko, Katerina Bilokur, and Polina Rayko. The first 3 gained incredible popularity in Ukraine during Soviet times, as well as medals at prestigious exhibitions abroad. Polina Rayko became known in artistic circles of Ukraine only after her death in the late 2000s and gained real resonance in the 2010s, as well as after the house painted with her drawings when a dam in Kherson region was blown up by Russians during the invasions of Ukraine in 2023. Creativity of these female artists is the story of ambitious, passionate, and talented women from Ukrainian villages who, despite all the hardships, sought to practice art. For them, this path meant many sacrifices. After all, they were born in a patriarchal society, where a woman from a simple family was denied the right not only to practice art professionally, but also to receive basic primary education. This is a story of soft resistance without resistance, and one of the biggest paradoxes of Soviet totalitarian art. When the system, which tries to control every movement of thought on the territory of a huge empire, suddenly fails and allows the existence of artistic phenomena that would seem to be absolutely hostile to socialist realism. And most importantly, The works of Primachenko, Bilokur, and Sobachka Shostak are completely unique artistic universes of incredible visual power and depth. Polina Rayko is a representative of a completely different, completely Soviet generation. She grew up in a totalitarian country that seemed unbreakable, but saw its sudden collapse and the following years of hardship and uncertainty. If Hanna Sobachka's art marks the transition from the pre-revolutionary avant-garde to socialist art, then Polina Rayko is a complete break with the world of Soviet senses, a deep journey into oneself, which has become iconic for a whole galaxy of modern Ukrainian artists. The story of Katerina Bilokur, with her escape into the world of unreal flowers, should be interpreted in the context of panorama of the artist's life in poverty and misunderstanding from those around her. Maria Primachenko created the best albums full of unforgettable images of magical beasts in 1936-37 against the background of terrible repressions and totalitarian hell. Polina Rayko begins to paint her house out of loneliness and emotional distress. In a certain sense, creation of their own mythological world is a practice of therapy for traumatic experiences. This ancient strategy of optimistic escapism as a form of resistance to trauma is the exact opposite to the tradition of modern art, where trauma, on the contrary, lives in the painting itself or any other work of art. In the 20th century, after the fake optimism of totalitarian aesthetics, modern art seems wary of expressing positive emotions, unless they are alienated and hidden behind the armor of irony or professional skepticism. Communicating with naive and folk paintings is a kind of therapeutic act and a challenge for a modern artist that questions the boundaries of her own practices. From this point of view, Naïve appears not only as a source base for the renewal of culture at the expense of the marginalized, but as a powerful worldview strategy, where freedom from stylistic conventions, use of the simple image techniques, sincerity, and pure heart aim to provide answers to the same questions that contemporary art is concerned with. The theme of a trauma has an ambivalent role in the fate of naive or outsider art. As self-taught researcher Daniel Wojcik shows in his work, trauma is one of the main tropes in the context of which it is customary to describe marginal artists of the world. Increased attention to the biographies of artists, their transformation into romanticized, literally decorated hagiographies, as well as emphasis on the author's traumatic experience, in the opinion of the researcher, sometimes does not benefit artists, exoticizing and marginalizing them even more. But at the same time, it is impossible to completely refrain from admiring the fates of such artists, because due to their pronounced singularity, they really provoke a non-standard release of emotions. This is clearly visible on the example of biographies of such Ukrainian artists as Katerina Bilokur and Polina Rayko. There is still no clear consensus among scholars regarding the terminological definitions of non-professional art and on the art of the women whom we are going to discuss in this series of short lectures. Mostly, the choice of vocabulary depends on the cultural context and specifics of each individual study. Naive, outsider art, self-taught art, folk art, all these terms have their shades of meaning, but should be applied very carefully. Over the years, the label of naive art has been attached to these artists. The niche of decorative and applied arts, which at one time saved authors such as Katerina Bilokur and Maria Primachenko from the watchful eye of the Stalinist system, eventually played a cruel joke on them. World-class artists found themselves on the margins of art history. Only today, the process of revising traditional Soviet narratives and stereotypes begins in Ukraine. In this context, the optics of analyzing the works of outstanding women of the generation of Maria Primachenko, Katerina Bilokur, and Hanna Sobachka-Shostak completely changes. The exhibitions of Katerina Bilokur and Maria Primachenko, which took place in 2015 and 2016 in the largest museum and exhibition complex of the country, Art Arsenal, were among the most visited projects in recent Ukrainian history. From the peripheral, half-forgotten figures, Maria Primachenko, Katerina Bilokur, and Hanna Sobachka-Shostak appear as one of the brightest and most interesting phenomena of Ukrainian art of the middle of the 20th century. After all, today in contemporary art, the line between professional and non-professional art is gradually being erased. Lack of professional education ceases to be decisive for the future career of an artist, and the art of outsiders is increasingly displayed at major exhibitions and biennales alongside more conventional works. Times change, the media through which art speaks is constantly updated. But the same ancient desire to create an image, the desire to be the creator of a whole world, which the brilliant self-taught artist Katerina Bilokur expressed in her famous credo, "I want to be an artist," remain eternal.